Thank you for the opportunity to present some preliminary data on the association between HIV status disclosure and stigma experiences among adolescents living with HIV in South Africa. Now, we base our analysis on existing literature, and we know that disclosure experiences is associated with stigma, potentially in a bidirectional way. We also know that disclosure may be linked with mental health. For example, people who disclose their status may have less mental health issues. Stigma may also be linked with mental health. So this is where we started. Just to look at some of these concepts, disclosure refers to the sharing of one's HIV positive status to partners, parents, or caregivers, and friends. As researchers, we measure different types of stigma, for example, internalized stigma, perceived stigma, and enacted stigma. Internalized stigma occurs when an HIV positive person accepts negative attitudes related with HIV and takes them as relevant to themselves. For example, feels ashamed of their HIV status. Perceived stigma refers to the extent to which HIV positive people perceive or anticipate discrimination or prejudice against themselves. For example, people in my community think that HIV is a punishment from God or from ancestors. And enacted stigma, on the other hand, is a negative public attitude towards people living with HIV, such as I have lost friends by telling them I have HIV. So these are the questions we're trying to answer. How is sharing your HIV positive state with different people and knowing your partner's status linked to stigma? How is disclosure of HIV positive status and knowing your partner's status linked to mental health? And how is stigma linked to mental health? So we are looking at data from two studies. The first is a study about adolescents living with HIV. So here we are trying to understand how adolescents living with HIV are dealing with their health, going to school, and their treatment. These adolescents were followed up 3 times, and then the team realized that they are having children, which gave birth to the Hey Baby study, with over 1,000 adolescent mothers and their children, and over 300 of these mothers are living with HIV. So for our preliminary analysis, we only included antiretroviral therapy or initiated adolescents, girls and young women who were aware of the HIV status from the 2 studies. So why are we looking at those who are aware of the HIV status? So we can only talk about disclosure when adolescent girls and young women know their own HIV status. So who are these adolescent girls and young women living with HIV in our sample? The majority of these young girls and young women were 18 years old. A quarter lived in rural areas and 90% lived in informal housing. 75% lives in homes where they lacked at least one basic necessity, such as having enough money for school uniforms, warm shoes, and warm clothes. A quarter of them did not have enough food at home in the past week for 3 meals a day. 19% of them were maternally and paternally orphaned. Now, looking at the link between disclosure and stigma, we found that the more you tell your friends about your HIV positive status, the more perceived stigma you experience. It can also go either way. The more perceived stigma, the more you share your HIV positive status with your friends. Knows partners' HIV status, whether positive or negative, more of this knowledge means more perceived stigma. It can also go both ways because maybe if you have perceived stigma, you are more likely to know your partner's status. Over here, we're looking at disclosure and mental health. So the more you share your HIV positive status with your caregiver, you will experience less depression. Or if you can also have the other way around. So less depression, the more likely you are to tell your caregiver your HIV positive status. So also more knowledge of your partner's status, less depression. Or you Recognized the other way, less depression, the more likely you are to know your partner's status. In this slide, we can see the more you share your HIV positive status with your friends or your peers, more trauma. And it could also go both ways. The more trauma you experience, the more likely you are to share your HIV positive status with your friends. Over here, we look at the link between stigma and mental health. So the more you internalize stigma, for example, feels ashamed of your HIV positive status, the more depression, anxiety, and suicidality you will experience. It also can go both ways. Also, the more perceived stigma, for example, people in my community think that HIV is a punishment from God or from ancestors, the more depression, anxiety, and suicidality you will experience. And this can also go both ways. In summary, some disclosure, for example, telling peers your HIV positive status and knowing partner's HIV status, increases stigma. Some stigma, for example, internalized and perceived stigma, increases mental health. And some disclosure, for example, telling your caregivers your HIV positive status and knowing your partner's status, reduces depression. So these findings have some implications for research. So we should support adolescents to share their HIV positive status with different people in a way that improves mental health and stigma. We also know that stigma is an issue, but we don't have strong evidence of stigma preventions, so we should focus on disclosure because that may affect both mental health and stigma. We should also try and understand where we can intervene. What are the programs that will work best? So one of the limitations is that we make use of cross-sectional data that limits our ability to draw conclusions about causal relationships and directionality. In future, we can focus on longitudinal data that can help us draw conclusions about causal relationships. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to answer any questions.